The first time the ground at Ashdown sighed, the kitchen window shivered, though there was no wind. Irisetta Cole felt it under her soles as something like a held breath finally let go. The sugar kettle hissed at a boil, the tin dipper rattled, and somewhere beneath the packed clay of the yard, a muffled pop traveled up through her bones like the echo of a name spoken through mud. She steadied the ladle and watched the ripples flatten into a shining skin. And in that gleam she saw, as clear as a looking-glass, the place where the earth had settled the fingers with overnight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. They said Ashdown Farm was built on a hill, but Irisetta knew that was a lie told by the house's white bones and high porch. The hill was no hill. It was a swell, a lip the land made where sand met clay and a stream once curved away. Everything on the Ashdown place was dressed up to look permanent. Whitewash on clapboards, carved pine banisters, rows of sycamores whose leaves flashed like mirrors in gusts. But the ground told its own truth if a person knew how to listen. And Irisetta had been listening since her first night under that roof, when she lay awake matching the creaks in the beams to the little ticks of settling under the floor. She had not come to Ashdown as a child. By the time they drove her past the gate, 2 pillars with a fat A carved in each, she was 22 and tall and careful, with hands that knew the weight of a cooper's adze and the temper of oak. She had learned barrels from her uncle on a river landing farther south, 6 seasons of shaving staves to an edge so true they sang when she struck them together. That work had taught her to see circles inside straight lines, to find the curve hiding in everything. It had also taught her letters, though nobody there would have admitted it out loud. Letters lived in marks, the chalk tally for staves cut, the knots for lengths of rope, the neat symbols she and Uncle Jeremiah scratched in the margins of scrap paper to count wages they would never touch. He would nod toward the river and say, "Water's a reader, Iris, finds every seam." She had tucked that in the place inside her where she kept thoughts she never let show on her face. At Ashdown, they put Irisetta in the kitchen because she could move fast and never spill, because her wrists were corded from shaving wood and kneading dough, because the mistress had decided the day she stepped down from the wagon that Irisetta's face would not rebel. It wasn't true. Rebellion lived in Iris like a nail the body grows around, but she knew how to keep her eyes steady and her mouth soft and her back straight, and so she was declared good for the house. The mistress liked neatness. Everything in the main rooms had a place and a polish. Brass warmed to the color of afternoon, the piano's keys a gleam of teeth, a row of family likenesses painted in oils, the Ashdown line all in black coats and lace. The master's name was Silas Ashdown, a man whose words smelt like the molasses he ate on bread, sweet enough to hide the grit in them. His wife, Mrs. Margaret, made a habit of crossing her arms whenever she asked a question, a stance that meant she could deny any answer and call it insolence. The overseer, Mr. Pike, never crossed his arms. He kept his hands loose and ready, twine round his wrist like a pledge. Under Pike, fields ran in rows as tidy as combed hair. Under him, the ledger stayed fat. Under him, children learned silence, and women learned to breathe from the upper part of their chests only. The first week, the kitchen clock broke. Irisetta took it down without asking, opened its back with a paring knife, and found the problem: dust packed into a gear like ground corn. A soft brush, a breath through pursed lips, a drop of lard to coax the teeth, and the clock resumed its soft tick, a heart behind painted Roman numerals. Mrs. Margaret was not pleased that Irisetta had touched it. She was pleased that the clock worked. She answered the one with a narrowed eye and the other with a tight corner of the mouth. "Be clever where I tell you," she said. That night, alone by the cold stove, Irisetta wrote the time on her wrist with the tip of a splinter. 8:3, then rubbed it away. It was not the hour she wanted to remember. It was something about the sound that gears had made when they caught and moved. How a thing that was stuck could be teased into doing its work again with the right touch and patience. It rained the second week, not a long rain, but full-bellied. the kind that hammers flat roofs and makes the smell under the floorboards crawl up into the house. Irisetta was washing greens when a hush fell in the yard, and then, pop, the ground spoke. She froze. The basin trembled in her hands, and a film of grit rose on the wash water. She thought of barrel hoops shrinking when wood dried, of joints that loosened when heat and cold worked them opposite ways. After supper, when she pretended to go to the stable to fetch vinegar, she went instead to the dip by the back step where the soil had sagged. The kitchen boy, Sol, trailed her like a thin shadow. His bare feet patterned with the kitchen soot. "What you looking at, Reese?" He called her that now, Reese, as if her name were too full to say whole. She crouched and touched the ground. The clay was clotted like old blood under the top layer, and the sag made a shallow blister. "This place keeps its secrets," she murmured. "What you hear is a word it don't know how to swallow." Sol's eyes, quick as minnows, darted to the house, to the window's lamp. "Pike don't like folks out after supper." "I'll be in before the bell," she said, though there was no bell. She pressed 2 fingers into the soft earth and felt a splinter, a root. No, she eased up a slip of something pale. Bone. Not big, not long, a piece like a wedge, the size of her thumb. Wide as the place where sun hardly ever reaches. She closed her hand around it so the night wouldn't see. It was not that she hadn't known bones beneath. No one who nighttime buried one of their own in the potter's corner of the orchard could pretend ignorance. But this was under the kitchen yard, under where the mistress's slippers clicked and the cook's heavy steps kept time. Later, up in the narrow space by the eaves where the kitchen folks slept on pallets, she slid the bit of bone from her pocket and held it to the small moon of her candle stub. Not animal, not pig nor poultry. Human, she thought. A knuckle, maybe. She pressed the edge of it to her palm and watched the pale imprint bloom and vanish. 31 names, she thought, without knowing why the number rose. 31. She whispered it, and Sol, half asleep beside her, muttered back, "Hush," and turned his face into the blanket. The next morning, when she rolled dough, she pinched off 31 little pellets and set them in a line like an abacus. Halfway through, she stopped. What was she counting? Flour? Eggs? Cups of lard? But the number sat in her head like the weight of a stave. Exact. Necessary. She made the biscuits and did not burn them. She scrubbed the scullery, where Mrs. Margaret would run her finger along the sill and frown if the pad lifted powder. She took the kitchen refuse to the heap by the willow and saw that the sag by the back step had widened. Earth had opened a mouth and then pursed it shut again. Over weeks, she learned the rhythms of the place. Dawn fire, wash water. The way Mr. Pike's steps on the side porch meant the day would move faster and harder. The way the master's cough in the morning meant he'd go to town and return late with chalk smoke on his cuffs. The trading house where he laughed too loudly with men who put a price on everything. She charted it all in a ledger that nobody saw. Not a paper ledger, not one that could be found and burned, but a way of noticing that put little scratches in memory and tied them together. To each scratch, she bound a letter or a number. She kept them like seeds in the dark. She learned who had the long stories. Old Mother June, who tended the kettle and could ease a fever with a cloth and a hum, knew the names of those whose backs had been broken and whose fingers had been twisted. She talked low over simmering pots. Elijah, who set the last roast straight. Prue with the dimple in her throat. Baby Mariah, whose feet never touched ground. June spoke as if she were planting these people in the air, and Irisetta cupped the spoken names like water and poured them into the place inside her where she kept the ledger. June's stories curled around faces Irisetta had never seen and gave them weight as sure as a barrel's rings. Late in summer, a girl in the house fell sick. 10-year-old Lydia Ashdown, freckles like flung milk across her nose, got it into her head that she would not keep food down.
The doctor came with his box and his husk of a voice, put a heated coin on the girl's belly as if to bribe her, and went away. Mrs. Margaret began to watch Irisetta the way a cat watches a crack under a door. "You," she said, "have a way with the stove. Try a broth." The first time, Lydia gagged. The second time, she swallowed. The third time, she asked if Irisetta would tell her a story. "I don't know stories," Irisetta said. Not the kind Lydia meant, with fairies and kings and wolves that talked. "Tell me what the kettle says," Lydia whispered. And Irisetta, against her own good sense, told the child that kettles complained about the way fire licked, that spoons bragged about the shine on their bellies, that onions gossiped because their layers could not mind their own business. Lydia laughed, color showed in her cheeks, and Mrs. Margaret's eyes softened the way a rope loosens when weight is lifted. That night, Sol whispered, "You gon' be their pet," with both envy and warning braided in his voice. Irisetta pulled her blanket to her chin and listened to the roof's quiet breathing. She thought of how a pet could walk inside the house unnoticed, and how a pet could hear before the lash fell. She thought of where knowing things started and where they ended. She thought of how dangerous water was when it wore a patient face.
The ground spoke again in September, when the heat lost its edge and the air smelled slick like the inside of a new barrel. Irisetta was alone, the light of fake yellow ribbon in the scullery, the house gone sleepy with the kind of silence that makes every small noise taste loud. Pop! The sag by the back steps widened into a shallow cradle, and this time the rain from days before had scoured away the thin crust. Beneath, a gray seam showed, fibrous, like the back of a wood shaping. She knelt, reached, and drew out a splinter that was not wood. It was a shard of coffin plank. She knew it by the smell. A sweetness turned wrong. She worked her fingers along it and felt a head of a nail come away in her hand, square cut, old. The earth sighed again, quieter now, and a corner of cloth winked up, brown and furred like a seed husk. She covered it. She stood. She went back to the stove and stirred the stew until steam hit her face. Later, when night had put on its soft shoes, she took Sol and June and the man called Cole, no kin but named like it, and the four of them made a shape of shadow in the yard, with a hoe and a spade in their hands. They moved the dirt one palm at a time. They lifted back plank and cloth. They did not say a name because they did not know it, and because any sound could travel where it should not. When the face showed, it was bones. When the hands showed, they were crossed as if the body had been laid down with respect that nobody present believed had been given. Irisetta swallowed air that tasted of iron and wet wood. June touched the little bones of the fingers as if counting inside her own head, then tucked the hands closer to the chest. They moved the bones under the apple tree, the far one that put its roots down in a seam of damp that nothing else wanted, and covered them gentle with soil. June planted 3 onion sets at the head. "So someone will eat," she whispered. "So someone will remember." On the edge of the grave, the earth still held a hollow print where a ring had resisted rot and then at last given up. Irisetta pressed her finger into that print. It fit. She withdrew her hand as if burned. 31, she thought, and saw them not as a string of pellets, but as a wide mouth of numbers, a line and a ledger that kept growing every time rain weighted the yard. The next day she couldn't keep from seeing the ground as a skin stretched over a body no one would name. When she boiled rags, steam did not hide the dip in the kitchen floor by the threshold where shoes had worn a groove in pine. When she took slops out, her steps skirted the place without her telling them to. When she laid down, she dreamed of barrels without hoops, staves splayed and falling. She did not tell the house what she had done, she told only the ledger inside her, and that ledger told her what must come next. Names. June had them in her mouth, but there were more, scraps like feathers caught in branches. Ellis, the boy whose lungs had flooded. Mary Lou, bent in the sun like a comma at the end of a sentence someone had never meant to write. There were the lost two, sold down river or sent up to some cold place, whose absence was a wound people walked around. Irisetta began to gather names the way she had once gathered the shape of a barrel, knowing how each stave leaned and held. She put letters to them in a place not on paper. She traced them on her arm with a wet finger and let them dry invisible.
A week later, Lydia coaxed her back to the piano room while Mrs. Margaret dozed with a Bible on her lap. "Play," the girl insisted. "I can't," Irisetta whispered.
"You can fix a clock," Lydia said, "so you can make a sound go where you want." She put Irisetta's hand on the ivory. The cold of it surprised her. She pressed. The note trembled open. She pressed another. A simple pattern showed itself, small as a drip on a sill. Lydia smiled as if she had birthed light. "You see?" Irisetta was thinking of patterns all the time now, of how rows of corn held and how the way they bent in the wind showed the shallow places. She began to carry the refuse barrel to the heap by a longer path so she could walk the yard's edges and feel where the ground gave. She learned to read settle lines as if they were fine script. She marked them in her mind with letters small as seeds. Then, because it wasn't enough to keep them in the dark, she tied knots in the apron cord she wore and told herself each knot stood for a life. She wore that cord around her waist, a private rosary against ordinary motion. In October, the master planned a harvest party. He did it every other year to prove plenty to men who measured respect by the spill of wine and the height of pies. Mrs. Margaret bustled like a hen when a hawk shadows the yard. "This must be the prettiest table in the county," she said, and chewed her lower lip until it shone. She ordered lights strung in the locust trees and had Mr. Pike sweep the yard till it looked like a newly planed floor. "Mind the dip," Irisetta said to Pike when he came near the back step with a broom. "A dip don't trouble a broom," Pike answered and ground his heel into the soft spot to prove it. The heel slank. He hissed and smoothed the place with his toe, quick as a lie, and went back to scouring stones with the broom straw's zip and scrape. That afternoon, the sky went the color of milk that's about to sour. Irisetta felt the taste of rain in the air, metalled in green, and made covers for the pies with old netting so the flies would not seize their moment inside the storm. She sent Saul twice to the spring house for cream. She cut a loaf of bread into neat squares and laid them in a basket that had been mended so many times that none of the original willow was left. Men with laugh-loud mouths arrived with their wives who looked as if their faces had been pinched into their bonnets and then released in the parlor. They praised the piano and the floor. They praised the new iron plow the master had imported and set on the porch for admiring. They praised the pie. They did not praise the hands that made the pie. "Good help," they told Mrs. Margaret, as if help came like mint in the spring, unasked, abundant, perfumed. After dark, a fiddler made the parlor jump, and the fields clicked with insects like a faraway fire. Irisetta moved among the dishes like someone back in the cooper's shop, walking between hoops and staves without catching an ankle. At the back step, the boards sighed under her weight. She put her heel down in the soft spot on purpose and listened. Beneath the fiddle, beneath the laughter, beneath the scrape of card chairs in the parlor, the ground made a tiny complaint, a word caught under a tongue. 31, she thought. 31, 31. Later, after the dancing, a man with a gray beard and a belly like a small keg stepped out on the porch for a breath and lifted his leg to spit into the yard. He stumbled, caught himself on the rail and laughed. "Your ground's got hollows, Silas." He said it like a joke. Something in Irisetta's chest tightened until the ribs didn't feel like hers. Silas waved a hand. "Old spring bed," he said. "Earth settles. We tamp it come morning." He took a swallow of wine and licked the corner of his mouth. "All land needs managing," he added, as if to bless his own idea of it. That night, while the last guest's wheels murmured away on the lane, while Mrs. Margaret rubbed the lotion into her hands that she said made them white as a dove, while Mr. Pike drew on a cigar beside the stable and sent it smoked upward like a crooked prayer, Irisetta slipped out to the willow with a candle cupped in her palm. June met her there without being called. Saul came because sunrise was always early inside him.
Cole came because he'd heard a story in the wind. 4 shadows again. They dug at the sagging place a little ways from the step where the earth had softened like a bruise. When the spade rang on something hard, Irisetta felt the sound fly into her teeth and lodge behind her tongue. They pulled away wet clay with their fingers. Cloth showed, then plank, then bone. 2, June whispered, because there were 2 heads touching. 2 small skulls where a board had cracked between them. June rocked back on her heels. Saul made a sound like when a calf sees a butcher's knife. Cole placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder and squeezed once, a pulse of human surety in the dark. They worked slower then, not from fear, but from the hush the dead put over the living when their shapes become clear. They lifted the bones one by one and carried them to the apple's far reach. June set them together so their foreheads almost kissed and whispered, sisters or brothers, or 2 who knew the same hunger. She planted tiny onion sets, 4 this time, so that something sweet can come out of a ground that was made bitter. In the morning, Irisetta made a pan of corn cakes and burned the first one deliberately so she could say, if asked, that smoke had made her eyes water. But nobody asked. The master had a head, and the mistress had a headache. Pike had a temper. The smoke went out the door unnoticed. The bitterness stayed under Irisetta's tongue and turned to iron. After that, she could not be content with counting. Counting was a way to keep what was there. It would not keep what could be taken. The ground would go on confessing in spits and sighs, but there would come a time, she could see it in the way Mr. Pike looked at the dip when he thought no one watched, when men would decide to fix the ground. Fix meant flatten. Fix meant pour fill dirt. Fix meant pack the mouths shut.
She began to make something that looked like nothing. In the afternoons, when dough rose and she could sing low to it to pass the time, she took scraps of coarse cloth and hemmed them fine. In each hem she knotted thread in patterns that meant letters only she would know. A row of 5 knots near the bottom meant a vowel. 2 knots above it meant a consonant from the front of the mouth. She did not write names in order. She stitched them into aprons and towels and the inside edge of a pillowcase. She told herself she was simply neat. She told herself neatness could be praised aloud while meaning could be kept private. She told nobody the alphabet she built from knots and breath and patience. She also began, when the oven was cooling and no one wanted to waste fire, to place little round cakes of clay on the hearth. She told Sol they were practice for biscuits. She told June they were for the children to play store. She pressed marks into them with the back end of a spoon, a straight line for an L, a cross for a T, a crescent for a C. The heat kissed them into hardness. She put them in a jar behind the vinegar, a place nobody wanted to smell. She did not call them letters out loud. She called them seeds. When winter edged itself under the doors, the ground tightened. It held its breath and did not speak. The sag by the steps froze into a shape that fit a palm. The apple tree slept with its fingers deep. June's hands cracked at the knuckles and bled a little into the bread dough she kneaded, and she said, "This is how we feed what feeds us." Pike kicked at the frozen yard and said, "See? Solid as a floor when it's cold." He tapped the ground with the toe of his boot as if he dared it to answer. It did not. Lydia's lessons resumed. Mrs. Margaret had decided the girl would play the piano as if it were a prayer and a cure at once. "It will teach her discipline," she told the master, and the words sounded like a kind of sugar she did not share. The tutor came in a blue coat and made long faces at the child's fingers until they learned to land where he wanted. When he left, Lydia called Irisetta to the room and played the little song Irisetta had made up at the beginning with 2 notes. She had dressed it in ribbons now. It had a left hand, it had a turn in the middle where it looked back like a rabbit at the mouth of its hole, and then ran on. "I want to write something," Lydia whispered, as if the house would scold her for the desire itself. "What?" Irisetta asked. "A book,"
the child said, "about the kettle and the spoons and the onions." Irisetta, who already kept the rough beginnings of a book in her knots and clay and breath, felt something like a door open and a draught come through. "Then you must listen hard and make a place for what you hear to sit." "What do you mean?" Lydia asked, and Irisetta lifted the girl's hand and touched the inside of her wrist lightly. "Here," she said, "where the skin is thin, where the beat is." Lydia went still. "You put it there first, then you find how to open your hand and let it come out onto the page." She could say that because Lydia's mother wanted her to say things that sounded like instructing a child in virtue, and not because sometimes at night Irisetta took a stub of chalk she had stolen long ago and wrote a letter on the underside of the palette where nobody would look. She rubbed it out with her sleeve and wrote it again for the pleasure of knowing the form would come when called. She could say it because letters had already saved her from coming apart, the way a hoop saves a barrel. In late January, a thaw came and undid everything the freeze had held in place. The yard softened. The dip at the step grew a pucker. Pike cursed and fetched a cart of dirt to tamp it, and when he lifted the shovel, the earth slid sideways like a tongue trying to spit something out. He swore again and called for 2 men, and in the clatter, shovels, the cartwheel, Pike's voice like metal, something in the sound loosened. Irisetta specked to the window and saw the shine of a nail-head in the churned earth. She put her hand to the sill and did not move until the men had laid down the dirt and tamped it and gone. Then she went outside with a bucket and kneeler and pretended to scrub the step. She loosened the little circle of silver with a bent spoon and lifted it into daylight. Not a nail, a ring. Dull and soft, like something worn a long time under skin. She closed her fist over it. When she opened, in the valley of her palm, mud made a print of something inside the ring. A letter, or half of one, the curve of a C, or the other half of a G. She did not clean it more there in the yard. She tucked it into the seam of her apron and washed slower so her face would look like washing wore it out.
In the scullery, she rinsed the ring in vinegar and rubbed it with salt until a flat yellow glowed. Inside, in a hand smaller than even Lydia's, someone had scratched a mark, not a maker's stamp, a letter done with something sharp and desperate. It was not a C, it was a J, trying to be brave on a little circle of gold. June, she thought, and then shook her head. June would never have worn such a thing. Jessa? Joanna? Jacob? The ring could have been a man's, small as a promise. It could have been a woman's, pared down by hunger. She held it to the candle and watched the flame make the letter waver as if it were breathing. She set it with the clay discs behind the vinegar and pressed her hand firm against the shelf as if to tell the wood to remember the weight. Spring promised itself with the sound of frogs and the smell of wet leaves going sweet. The apple tree put up fists of pale green. Children got damp hems and scoldings. The ledger in the master's study got plumper as he entered numbers that said harvest would be better this year if the weather behaved. Weather didn't behave. It did what it pleased. It put a shine on the river that made men think of coins. It put a funk in the hollows that made women think of graves. One night, a storm came hard as thrown nails. The house shrugged and groaned. The willow made the sound of hair ripping. In the morning, the yard had become a script the rain had written with a sloppy hand. Everything loose had been carried to the low places. In the sag by the step, the storm had left a message. A corner of wood, a length of hinge, a scrap of cloth with 5 stitches still holding stubborn in a zigzag. Irisetta crouched and put her hand near and did not touch. Not then. She went inside and pulled the bundle of rags for washing, and with it her courage. When she came back, Pike was there, swearing, jabbing the shovel as if the earth had insulted him. "Damnable place," he said, and hooked up the hinge and plank together like a dead fish. The cloth came with them, and for a second only, the 5 stitches looked like writing. Not letters exactly.
5 knots between 2 rows. Irisetta's throat closed. That was her code. That was her. She had stitched that into an apron hem and lost that apron to a fire when grease had jumped in a pan and caught her wrong. "Trash," Pike said, and flung the puzzle onto the cart. Irisetta moved the way a person moves who doesn't want to be noticed wanting, and when she passed the cart, she let her hand trail. Cloth stuck. She pulled. The scrap came with her, kissed her palm with mud, and then lay obedient in the bowl she carried. Inside the scullery, she washed it in the leftover tea. The knot softened and then held. The zigzag still told the sound it was meant to say. It was a beginning of a name. Joe. Then the cloth tore where the fire had chewed it long ago. Joe, Irisetta whispered to the vinegar jar where the ring with the J slept. June came in and saw the scrap and the jar, and the way Irisetta held her mouth and said nothing for a full minute. When she spoke, she put her voice on the table with her hands. "We're going to have to mark them, Reese." "We have," Irisetta said, fingers on the nuts at her waist. "We do. Not so the living can hear, so the land can't be lied about when men come with their dirt and say it was always this way." She poured a little tea into 2 cups. They sipped. It was the kind of tea that tasted more of water than leaf. June folded her hands. "You know how to set a circle true, and you can read the ground." "I can read a little," Irisetta said, and looked down so the truth would not burn her cheeks.
June kissed her 2 fingers and pressed them to Irisetta's wrist with a beat head. "That's a lot." She leaned close. "We make a map," she said. They made it with what they had. A pan turned upside down became a sky. Starlight on a clear night mapped itself to the yard when Irisetta stood where the sag spoke loudest and looked up. June named constellations differently than the book would have. The Little Dipper was a song spoon, the North Star the first nail. They set pebbles where stars sat, then set bits of charcoal where the ground gave. They did it night after night, in the hour when house sleep is deep and the world pretends it is kind. Soul learned to carry in his toes. Cole learned to hold his breath for long stretches, so if Pike passed by, he would be nothing but shadow. They muttered names like a prayer and didn't say amen. When the map to be made without looking at the sky, Irisetta did it with flour on the board one morning and then swept it off before the clock struck 6. When the map could be made with closed eyes, she took the jar of clay discs and pressed one, then another into the hearth's warm brick while a loaf browned and a stew simmered. 31 discs, she told herself. But when she reached 27, her finger hesitated, and something like a little bird with wet feathers hopping away from her hand, made her doubt. What if there were more? She held off finishing. She put the jar back. She tied her apron. She went to work with the movements of someone who knows the house has eyes and chooses to give it nothing to see. One afternoon in May, when the sky had the color of memory, a blue you get only out of winter's patience, Mrs. Margaret went to the orchard with Lydia for early peaches. Irisetta watched them steer their long dresses around the onion shoots that marked the graves under the apple. It looked like a dance. Mrs. Margaret picked a fruit too soon and wrinkled her nose when it bit back with green. Lydia set hers on the fence rail and watched a bee decide. "You made that tune longer," Irisetta said when the girl sat with her in the kitchen later and hummed it. "I did," Lydia said. "It needed a place to rest." "Everything does," Irisetta answered, and thought of bones under boards. 2 days later, a letter came with an official look. Silas read it in the parlor with his mouth at an angle that meant he tasted something he couldn't name. He went to Pike with it, and a plan began. "We're to host the committee," he said at supper, and this time his voice had a hurry in it that made the soup tremble in its bowl. "About drainage," he told Mrs. Margaret. "They want a demonstration. The governor's men say we'll set a model for the county." "Drainage?"
the mistress said, and touched the pearls at her neck as if they could pull the word into something pretty. Improvement, Silas translated. We'll take the low ground, the marsh by the kitchen, and make it useful. Pipes, fill, a new cistern, the latest ideas. They'll write about Ashdown in the paper. He smiled with all his teeth and none of his eyes. Irisetta put a spoon down careful so it would not clink. She felt the house lean a little toward the window as if it wanted to see what a lie looked like when it set its hat in the parlor. She looked at June. June's mouth made a small O and then pressed itself flat. That night, Irisetta lay awake and counted, not sheep, but all the ways men wrote things down that erased what had been. A map with a new straight line, a ledger with a column called Profit, a newspaper with a story about progress built on the backs of people until their bones were ground to chalk. She thought of the clay discs, dumb and brave behind the vinegar. She thought of the pebbles on the pan. She thought of Lydia's tune needing a place to rest. She thought of June's onion shoots, stubborn green tongues tasting the air. She reached for the chalk and wrote a letter under the palette where no one would see and rubbed it away and wrote it again until her finger whitened and her nail wore thin. J, she wrote, then O. The committee came on a day that refused weather, neither hot nor cold, like a polite guest who leaves no trace. Men from town, their hats careful, their boots with a thin frosting of dust that said they did not walk far. They shook hands with Silas. They looked at the yard with eyes that saw only where they meant to put a pipe. Pike showed them the spot, and one of the men prodded it with a cane like a doctor checking for tenderness. The ground kept its voice. It would not speak where it was watched. Here, Silas said, we'll dig down, lay a drain. Water's been pooling. A nuisance. Turn it useful. He clapped Pike's shoulder. We improve. The man with the cane nodded and made a note in a little book. His pencil looked like a stake. Irisetta thought of how a stake went into ground whether the ground welcomed it or not. She thought of how a hoop could be forced and a stave bent to fit. She breathed in. She breathed out. The men went in for coffee. The yard exhaled. When night sat, Irisetta pulled Sol from his pallet and June from her breath and Cole from his watch by the stable and said, we move them now.
June nodded once, the kind that says decision has finally found its true chair. Sol swallowed so his throat clicked. Cole rolled his shoulders like a man going to lift something he knew would make his back sing the next day. They took the hoe and the spade and their hands. They took a basket lined with a sheet so thin it showed the weave of the world. They took the jar of clay discs and the ring with the J and the scrap with the knots that spelled Joe when held just so. They moved like people who had practiced all their lives for the one thing they were not supposed to have to do. The first body they lifted had been bones for so long, the earth knew the shapes and offered them up gentle. The second broke Irisetta's heart a second time because the little skulls had learned to rest together and the ground did not want to let go. June whispered stories the whole time, like a gentle hammer tapping a hoop down. Steady, steady. Sol caught his breath and let it out as clouds. Cole stood guard with his big hands open, as if the night itself might put something into them. Time went strange. The moon walked from one tree to another and seemed to lean on each for a rest. When the basket felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with weight, they carried it to the far side of the orchard where the ground held instead of giving way and where the apple's roots did not drink this sorrow. There they had already dug a long bed with the care of people making a place fit to hold what mattered. They laid the bones. They put the onion sets in between. They spoke no names out loud, but Irisetta's mind shouted them, Elijah, Prue, Mariah, Joe. The ring lay in her pocket, heavy as a promise and light as a lie. When they returned for the next, a sound stopped them that wasn't night and wasn't wind. A footstep on the far porch. Pike. His cough a dry bark. A match flared and his cigar's ember made a little red eye in the dark. "Who's there?" he called, and the words pushed through the yard like boots.
Irisetta crouched and pulled Sol down with her. June melted against the well's shadow. Cole slid behind the feed barrel and slowed his breathing to the pace of a man who had learned to outwait trouble. Pike came down the steps and put his heel in the soft place, as if he could press the earth back into obedience. He stood there a moment, and then, to everyone's astonishment and terror, he laughed. Not loud, not the laugh from the harvest party. A small laugh, the kind a man makes when he thinks of something he hates to love. "Talking again, are you?" he said to the ground. "You hush. Tomorrow you'll have a pipe in your throat." He took a long pull on the cigar and flicked ash into the sog. It fell like snow on a wound. He turned and went back in, his steps telling the boards what they already knew. Irisetta's hands had gone numb. She flexed them and felt the blood return, and with it a clean anger. "We don't have until tomorrow," she said. June nodded, and they went back to the work of lifting the dead out of the mouth of a plan. It took until the sky thought about paling. 31 times they went back and forth, but Irisetta refused to count aloud at the end. The numbers had begun to feel like a rope that could be used to bind as easy as to measure. In the long bed, the onion shoots lay in their rows like a quiet choir. June put her palm on the last cover of dirt and held it there until the warmth from her skin crept down and told the ground what it needed to know. They were smoothing the surface with their palms when a sound tore the morning like cloth. Hooves on the lane. Not the slow clop of a single rider, a handful. Men with business early. Irisetta's heart flipped and then spun, that open barrel feeling where everything you'd put inside might fly out if you moved wrong. Pike's door banged. He swore. Silas's window scraped. Lydia coughed herself awake. The farm was rousing to a new day that had no business starting so loud. June grabbed Irisetta's wrist hard enough to bruise. She said, "The jar. The ring." "The discs," Sol added, eyes huge. Cole pointed with his chin toward the kitchen. "Go." They ran crooked as rabbits. Irisetta slid through the scullery door and went to the vinegar shelf and felt for the jar with hands that could not stop shaking. Cool glass, the powder taste of panic in her mouth. She pulled the jar. It was lighter than it had been. Her stomach dropped. She loosened the lid. Inside the clay discs lay, but the ring. Footsteps in the passage. Mrs. Margaret's voice sharp as I snapped bone. "What are you doing in here before dawn?" Irisetta turned with the jar in both hands, and the room went small around her. Through the window, hoofbeats cudgeled the yard. Men shouted. Pike cursed and laughed in the same breath. The ground under the back step let out a new sound. Not a sigh this time, not a pop, a crack like a chest breaking open. The scullery wall trembled. A hairline fissure stitched itself from the doorframe down to the baseboard in a crooked seam. Miss Margaret took one step forward. Her eyes dropped to the jar. She frowned as if the smell of vinegar had turned. "What is that?" she asked. Irisetta opened her mouth to make a word that could pass as harmless. Nothing came. The crack in the wall widened to hair. Outside, the men's voices rose in a tangle of surprise and triumph. The ground had given up more than a whisper. Miss Margaret opened her mouth to call, to summon Pike or Silas or the Lord himself. Irisetta saw the shout forming before she heard it. She felt time tilt. She had a breath where the whole house was a clock in her hands, gears stalled and waiting for the touch that would make them move. She took it. And then... The story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The shout broke in Mrs. Margaret's throat, like a plague dropped and caught halfway. A gasp snagged on pride. Irisetta felt the house stutter around that half-made cry, every board and hinge listening to what would come of it. Outside, hooves slashed the yard's wet skin and men's voices rose sharp as thorns. The jar sweated in Irisetta's hands, vinegar breathed up into her face. In her apron, the ring pressed, urgent. "Answer me," Mrs. Margaret said, a whisper trying to grow into a bell. Irisetta set the jar down on the table with both hands, carefully, as if it were a newborn, and lifted her chin. She looked the mistress in the eye and made her voice small, not from fear, but as if speaking to a skittish animal. "The vinegar is spoiled," she said. I was clearing the shelf. Mrs. Margaret's gaze slid to the crack in the wall and then back, a seam of suspicion stitched by habit. "Do not touch what I don't tell you to," she said, but the edge in her words had dulled. The sound outside had pulled the blade away. Pike's boot hammered the back step. Men tumbled into the yard carrying shovels and a length of pipe bright as a lie. "Ma'am," he hollered toward the house, "you'll want Mr. Silas." His voice had the glee of a boy who found something he can break without being scolded. He yanked at the door and then remembered himself and thumped off toward the front. Mrs. Margaret's spine straightened until it looked made of wire. She gathered her skirt in one hand, her voice in the other. "Fetch the master," she told Irisetta, "and mind your eyes." Irisetta did not move. It was a refusal small as a held breath, and yet her body knew it as surely as a hoop knows its circle. Outside, hooves slashed the yard's wet skin, and men's voices rose sharp as thorns. The jar sweated in Irisetta's hands. Vinegar breathed up into her face. In her apron, the ring pressed, urgent. "Answer me," Mrs. Margaret said, a whisper trying to grow into a bell. Irisetta set the jar down on the table with both hands, carefully, as if it were a newborn, and lifted her chin. She looked the mistress in the eye and made her voice small, not from fear, but as if speaking to a skittish animal. "The vinegar spoiled," she said. "I was clearing the shelf." Mrs. Margaret's gaze slid to the crack in the wall and then back, a seam of suspicion stitched by habit. "Do not touch what I don't tell you to," she said, but the edge in her words had dulled. The sound outside had pulled the blade away. Pike's boot hammered the back step. Men tumbled into the yard carrying shovels and a length of pipe bright as a lie. "Ma'am," he hollered toward the house, "you'll want Mr. Silas." His voice had the glee of a boy who found something he can break without being scolded. He yanked at the door and then remembered himself and thumped off toward the front. Mrs. Margaret's spine straightened until it looked made of wire. She gathered her skirt in one hand, her voice in the other. "Fetch the master," she told Irisetta, "and mind your eyes." Irisetta did not move. It was a refusal small as a held breath, and yet her body knew it as surely as a hoop knows its circle. Outside, metal kissed stone with a ringing clarity. Men shouted, then the sound of laughter turned wrong. "Ma'am?" Pike's voice again, suddenly tight. "You best come see." Mrs. Margaret hesitated, the habit of command warring with the habit of being escorted to shock. "Stay," she told Irisetta reflexively, an order that could not hold the air, and swept out. Irisetta followed silent, the way a shadow follows the woman who cast it. They reached the yard as two committee men stood with their hats off and their mouths shaped into respectable astonishment. The pipe lay forgotten, the shovel leaned against the well. The earth, disturbed by all that insistence, had answered with something you could not call cooperation. Where the sag had been, where Pike had stomped and smoothed and promised a fix, water had pooled, and in the dull shine of that water lay a circle of yellow, like a small sun, a second ring, slick with mud, catching the morning. For a time, nobody moved. The discovery made a shape around them, a room inside the outside. Silas arrived with hair awry and his coat unbuttoned, his face set to greet the day's importance. Then he saw the thing at his feet and reset himself with an effort that showed in his hands. "What are you men gawking at?" he said, although his voice had lost its swagger. "A trinket?" He bent, but not all the way. He looked to Pike to do the bending. Pike crouched and plucked the ring out of the puddle with 2 fingers, as if pinching off a wart. He rubbed it on his shirt and revealed a slim band engraved with something that could be flourishes, or it could be letters if you wanted them to be. He flicked a glance at Irisetta and then away, like a man who swears a shadow moved and decides he won't admit it. "A lady loses a ring," Silas said, finding his footing in a storyline and climbing it quick. "Poor housekeeping to have it fester in the yard. Pike, see this ground drained, properly." He offered a tight smile to the committeemen. "You see, all the more reason for improvement." The men nodded, relieved to have a narrative that did not invite more seeing. One made a jaunty note in his book. Found object on site, indicates poor maintenance of kitchen yard, drainage recommended forthwith. Irisetta tasted iron. The small sun in her pocket burned against her leg. June stood just behind her, her hand low, fingers counting something nobody else could see. "Work to do," Silas barked, coaxing action as if a loud enough command could repair the moral fiber of dirt. Pike spat into the puddle and stepped into it, heel first. The water swallowed his boot and belched a single bubble. "Shovel," he said, and men bent. The shovels bit, and the ground answered like a tired animal harried beyond patience. Each scoop loosened a little more of the place's memory. In their edges, in the grave-cold cloth, in the rib of plank, another circle of yellow winked and swam. Then, not yellow, ivory, the end of a long bone. The house inhaled. Even the committee book paused. "Get back," Pike snapped, but his voice wavered. Silas's face went hard and bright like porcelain. "Keep digging," he said, and if there had been a wall to climb behind the words, he would have climbed it and pulled the ladder up. They could not dig fast enough to bury what the earth now insisted on showing. A line of coffin boards appeared, a seam, then a shape, then the suggestion of two shapes, then the fact of them. Water, greedy to be noticed, slicked over everything and made the yard a mirror of sky, and in that sky, reflected, 31 stars might as well have burned. The committee men, suddenly men and not committee, stepped back. One crossed himself, the other closed his book.
Silas's face did a thing Irisetta had never seen it do. It flinched, as if names could strike. Pike's lip curled. The committee men looked at one another as if passing a cup nobody wanted. "We will mark them," Irisetta said. "We will make a place where the truth can sit and be seen." "How?" Lydia asked, and her voice, small and untutored in the ways of cruelty, fell like clean rain. "With what we have," Irisetta said, "with onions and stone and song, with letters made in clay, with a ring that bears a J." She took it from her pocket and held it up so that even the day had to look. "With a story you will not be allowed to forget." Silas found his anger then, the kind that puts a shine on meanness. "You presume," he said, channeling his humiliation toward the nearest living target. "Pike." Pike moved, the lash already in his hand the way some men's words are already in their mouths. He took 2 steps before Cole stood in his path, and the air around them went still like the moment before a struck clock decides whether to ring. "No," Cole said. That was all. He did not lift a fist. He made of his body a simple truth. This will not pass. "Get out of my yard," Silas hissed at the committeemen, who half turned, half stayed, trapped between witnessing and cowardice. "This is a private matter." "It is not," Irisetta said. "What lies under the ground is everybody's matter once it begins to speak." The pastor arrived, not because Silas called him, but because word runs faster than a horse when the ground shakes. He came at a trot, hat pressed to his head, the book under his arm. He looked from mud to faces to the onion bed and swallowed. "Lord," he said, a word with more weight in it than usual. "Say a prayer," Silas commanded. "No," Irisetta said again, mimicking of Cole's refusing. "Listen first." The pastor had the good sense to close his book. "Tell it," he said, eyes on Irisetta, ignoring the shape of Silas's anger the way one ignores a fly. She told it clean, how the ground had sighed, how they had lifted bones and carried them to the orchard, how onion shoots had marked the place, how a ring with a J had come back into the air like a word pulled from water. She did not accuse with what she did not know. She accused with what could be held in the hand and what had been felt in the feet. As she spoke, June put her palm on the long bed. Sol set the jar of clay discs on the low wall like an offering. Cole stood with his hand still open, catching the day's light. Lydia, whose lessons had given her the habit of ordering sound into sense, listened as if to a piece of music that finally showed its shape. Mrs. Margaret watched her child and her husband with a face that kept changing its mind. When Irisetta finished, the yard held its breath. A breeze licked the willow. A crow took a hop closer as if it had been waiting for the right sentence. Silas laughed, but it was a ragged strip of cloth more than a sound. "Stories," he said. "You expect me to, build a shrine? For refuse?" He gestured toward the ground as if that could snatch back what it had given. The pastor cleared his throat.
"The law requires," he said gently, "that when a burial place is discovered, work stop, the magistrate be informed, the dead be—" He looked at the onion bed and chose his word carefully, "revered." "The law applies to white folk," Pike muttered, a thought he had learned young and worn like a talisman. "The law applies to the living who will be judged," the pastor said, surprising himself with his courage. He stepped forward and put a hand on the fence. "And the Lord judges what men do with what the earth gives back." Silas turned his glare to the committeemen, seeking labor for his anger. "Write," he ordered. "Write that this is slander. Write that these people—" He swallowed the old word and replaced it with a newer one he could live with in company. "Servants have stolen rings from my house and tossed them in the yard to make a story." Irisetta held a ring aloft again, and in the light the jay glowed stubborn as a star that refuses to be outshone by morning. "If this ring belongs to your house, then say whose finger wore it. Say when you last saw it. Say why it lay under your kitchen step." Silas said nothing. "We will form a committee," the braver of the committeemen offered, eager to be useful without having to be brave again. "An inquiry." "An accounting," the pastor corrected. "Names." He looked at Irisetta and then at June. "Can you show us where you removed them?" he asked, tripping on a simple word because the truth had raised the floor under his feet and made him clumsy. June nodded and led, her cracked hands sure. The small procession, committee, pastor, Pike smoldering, Silas, forced into walking where he would rather not, followed to the orchard. Lydia came too, her fingers tucked in the fist of her dress. Mrs. Margaret let her go, something tired in her eyes that had nothing to do with sleep.
"What is this?" a committeeman asked, as if he had never seen a plant mark anything but appetite. "Markers," Irisetta said, "because we had nothing the world would recognize as such, because the ground needed to know somebody noticed." She set the jar of clay discs on the soil and unscrewed the lid. "Letters," she said, and poured them into her palm. The small rounds clicked together, modest music. For those who want their story to sit in the hand. Lydia leaned close and touched one with the care of a child who knows breakage. "What does this one say?" she asked, and her fingertip rested on the crescent Irisetta had pressed into the clay with the back of a spoon. "Sea," Irisetta said, "or moon, or both." "Can I learn?" Lydia whispered, hungry in a new way. Mrs. Margaret made a small sound and then did not take it back. Irisetta nodded once, a movement the size of a seed being planted. The magistrate came by noon with his seal in his hat and his need to be seen as rightful. He looked at what men told him to look at, then had to look at what the ground demanded. He cited statutes. Silas performed indignation. Pike performed boredom. The pastor performed a courage that was beginning to feel like truth wearing his mouth. The committeemen performed responsibility. June, Irisetta, Sol, and Cole did not perform. They stood where they had always been and watched a kind of theater they had not asked for unfold on the stage of the yard. By mid-afternoon, an order had been given that nobody understood the cost of. All work to stop, a fence to be erected, a survey to be made, a record to be kept. The words sounded like limestone, heavy, pale, indifferent, but in them lay a space where something could grow. Silas went indoors and did not slam the door because men with titles stood on his porch. Pike stalked the perimeter like a dog denied a bone. Mrs. Margaret moved as if balancing cups on her head, careful not to spill rage or sorrow. Lydia sat on the top stair with her elbows on her knees and looked at Irisetta the way some look toward a horizon they mean to reach. "Now we work different," June said softly as they returned to the kitchen, and the words arranged the room like furniture. Different began with small things. Irisetta cooked and kept the house fed, but her hands now marked the world in plainer ways. She stitched the hem codes bigger on the insides of the arm towels, where even a lazy eye would feel them when drying its hands.
She placed clay letters on the sill to dry and did not tuck them behind vinegar, as if sun could teach them to speak more boldly. She let Lydia watch as she pressed shapes and told her the story of J and O, and how some letters curve like the river and some stand like fence posts. At night, she and June and Sol and Cole walked the yard in a pattern that felt like prayer and patrol at once. They checked the fence around the old kitchen ground and around the new bed. They listened to the earth with their feet. They counted onion tips. They taught the wind the names it should carry through the trees. On a near evening, Pike cornered Irisetta by the well. He had the look of a man whose power had been told to sit in a chair for the first time and didn't know what to do with its hands. "You think you've done something," he said, smiling without humor. "You and your old witch and your boy and that ox, you think names are a fence." "I think they're a door," Irisetta said, "and you can leave a place through a door." She held his gaze until his smirk cracked like a dry board. He stepped closer, breath hot with chewing tobacco and spite. "Murmur," he muttered. "Careful, talk travels. Papers can say what a man tells them. Stories can bend." "Water bends too," Irisetta said, leaning just enough to make him feel how unafraid she would be in front of his threat. He grabbed her wrist, quick, mean. He meant to feel how the pulse beat there, meant to know if fear lived inside the beat. He met something else. Something steady as the sound of a stave being shaved true. He let go first. "You won't win," he said, and walked away with a stiffness that did not belong to his legs. Days shaped themselves around a waiting that was not passive. The magistrate sent men with measuring chains who made small marks on big paper and admitted nothing with their mouths while their hands trembled faintly when the chain grazed a bone. The pastor began to come in the afternoons and sit on the low wall by the onion bed, reading the names in Genesis out loud. After the begats, he would close his book and ask June for names that weren't written, and she would oblige until the sun lay a coppery hand on the orchard and the flies grew bold. Lydia returned to the piano after a week of refusing all songs. Her little tune had altered itself, matured on its own, finding a minor place and then rising anyway. She came to the kitchen with a handful of pebbles and asked Irisetta to show her how to lay a map in stars. Their heads close, their fingers arranging, they revived the constellation of the yard upon the upturned pan. The song spoon glittered. The first nail held true. Lydia's lips moved, silently naming, while beyond the window Mrs. Margaret watched and did not call her away.
One noon, a wagon came unexpected with a barrel of quicklime, and men hired cheap to pour it. "From Mr. Ashdown," the foreman said, not meeting the pastor's eye, "instruction to purify." He spat into the grass as if to clear the taste of the word. "Instruction revoked," the magistrate's clerk said, appearing like a moral from a fable. "Order posted, hands off." He nailed a paper to the fence that said, in words worth less than water and yet not nothing, that the ground would be left to those who could speak for it now. Pike laughed and went back to his rounds, but he counted the nails in the paper and learned something from their number, even if he pretended he hadn't. Silas raged in the parlor, hatred braided with humiliation. Mrs. Margaret observed the portrait of an ancestor whose paint had cracked in the sun and wondered whether the painter had ever imagined the face would have to look upon such a day. Lydia stole away and pressed 2 palms to the clay letters, picking up their powder on her skin as if learning a new kind of dust. Night deepened into a kind of summer that makes every smell large. The orchard sweetened, the kitchen smoked and sang. The onion bed, watered by the day's heat, breathed up a scent both green and grave. And Irisetta, who had become the seam between what the ground would reveal and what the living would admit, lay down on her pallet and slept like a person who has put a heavy thing down and is now guarding it with her body. She dreamt that the yard rose in waves, not to drown, but to lift.
People whose names she had planted stepped onto their feet with the solemn surprise of the long sleeping. They did not accuse, they stood. They looked toward the house without malice. They looked toward the river and smiled. She woke with tears cooling on her temples and the ring imprinting a circle on her palm. Work of the old kind never ceased. Hunger does not respect righteousness. Irisetta cooked, mended, taught, listened. The others chopped, hoed, sewed. And all the while a plan grew that was less a plan than a recognition. If a place could be made to tell the truth about the dead, perhaps the living could stand up straighter within it. Perhaps men who counted only coin could be made to count different. Then came the day when someone came to buy them. It arrived as a paper before it arrived as a wagon. An offer for 3 hands to be sent to a cousin's property where discipline is more exacting, as Silas put it, standing in the kitchen doorway with a legal brightness about him like oil. He read the names as if they were groceries: Cole, Soul, Irisetta. The room tilted. June's knuckles whitened as she kneaded dough that had to be punched down just then hard to keep from over-rising. Lydia, at the table with her letters, made a sound like a string snapping. Payment heals embarrassment, Silas said to nobody while looking at Irisetta. You'll find another kitchen. You'll find another yard, Irisetta answered without heat, and the words made his face go the color of old butter. Pike's grin showed a stub corner of tooth. He told nobody in particular, and the command skittered around the room looking for a back to land on. They had an hour to gather what was not theirs. June pressed a bundle into Irisetta's hands: a slice of cornbread, a twist of salt, the clay discs, and the ring. If you have to leave, you take the story, she said. If you have to leave, you leave planted what can't be moved. Lydia flew like a bird bounced off a window pane and landed at Irisetta's knees. Don't go, she said, and tried to make the imperative build a wall. I will be where the letters are, she whispered, where you let them be. Mrs. Margaret came as if commanded by a part of herself she ignored. She looked at the bundle in Irisetta's hands and the onion shoots beyond the window, and the child's powder-smeared fingers. Silas, she called evenly, if you send these 3 away, you will have a scandal your committees will not mend. He snorted. The scandal is already here. Then behave as if you were not its engine, she said, surprising herself and everyone else. Wait for the magistrate's paper. Pike rattled his rope and rolled his shoulder like a bully loosening up. He did not anticipate the pastor, the committeeman, the clerk, the 2 neighbors who had come because gossip and conscience sometimes arrived together, the teacher whose house sat by the lane and who had overheard her pupils whispering about rings and onions, walking up as if convoyed by a better day. The lane delivered them. They filled the kitchen yard. They stood between Pike's rope and the 3 names on the paper, and in their faces lived a recognition none of them would yet call repentance. The truth had dragged them to a place where standing aside would leave a stain they could not scrub. Hold, he read, breathing hard. His paper shook, whether from heat or courage did not matter. Silas slapped the paper with the back of his hand as if to bruise it. My property, he said, and the word sounded as if it no longer fit a mouth shaped by the morning's learning. The pastor raised his book, not as shield, not as weapon. The Lord requires we do justice and love mercy, he said, voice quieter than a lash and somehow stronger. You will not add hurry to harm. Pike looked to Silas for permission to proceed by other means. Silas looked at the number of eyes on him and calculated. Money has a way of going cold when a man cannot spend it without losing face. He flung his hand toward the house. Fine, for the day.
Summer burned down into that stacked heat August keeps under 10. The onions sweetened to a kind of laughter when cooked slow. Lydia's tune gained a steady hand. Pike stopped walking the fence. Silas began to spend his hours in the rooms where portraits hung and numbers pretended to be absolutions. Mrs. Margaret started to sit at the wall with sewing she did not need to do. Then war reached them, not as soldiers first, but as a change in the way the air moved. Rumors have a temperature. This one cooled things even at noon. Men left and did not come back by evening. Letters arrived that could not be eaten or planted. The pastor preached about times and seasons and the folly of pretending that what a man builds is what a man keeps. Silas walked faster. Pike whistled less. The first troop to pass came like a bad wagon rolling downhill, fast, noisy, parts threatening to fly. They wanted water and bread, boots mended, directions to where blood was thickest. They saw the wall and laughed and did not understand it. They drank well water without thanks and went. The second troop stopped. A young officer, with his face still soft with whatever life had kept him from harshness, put a hand on the gate as if to test its hinge. "What's this?" he asked, curiosity running out ahead of his authority. "A place for names," Iraseta said. "Those who worked here and were put down without notice. We noticed." He looked at the onion tops and the neat wall and the way the gate swung. He nodded. "Good," he said, and surprised himself. "We go out to make a world where—" He stopped because a slogan will not walk past a grave and keep its tone. "We go out," he said instead, "so we can come back different. I hope this is still here when we do." "It will be," Iraseta said, and because she said it like a hammer strikes true, he believed her. War's mouth bit into men and ground their names. Ashdown changed because the world had forced it, and also because a wall had taught it how to sit in a truth. People fled through its lane at night toward the river's rumor of freedom. The kitchen fed those who could not risk a fire. Pike disappeared in a month of dust and did not send word. Silas negotiated with representatives of governments that kept changing their boots. Mrs. Margaret took to sleeping with the window open and listening to the willows speak. Lydia grew taller and more certain, a reed that learns it can sing as well as bend. One winter night, cold so clean it made the stars brittle, a wagon creaked up and halted. A woman climbed down with a shawl and a jaw and a purpose. She looked into the kitchen as if looking into a story she had heard and not dared to believe. "Is there a place here for the dead to be called correct?" she asked without hello. "There is a place," June said, standing, wiping her hands. "We do our best." The woman opened her hand and showed a little scrap of cloth with 5 knots between 2 rows, blackened by fire. "My sister," she said. "We were told she sank. She didn't. I followed the river, and then the road, and then the talk." "Joanna Little," Iraseta said, and the name fit the room like a long-missed piece of furniture. The woman cried then, but the kind that waters, not floods. They went to the wall. They said the name together. They pressed the scrap inside the postguard where mortar could eat it and make it stone. When spring came again, a different spring, a spring made by men's letters and hunger and loss, the world opened its gates the way a gate opens when its hinge has been mended and oiled. Papers changed hands. Chains were dropped without kindness by the same fingers that had lifted them. The law said a new thing, and did not teach men's hearts it. Work began again of the kind that does not require permission from a paper. Silas aged. He failed to learn fast enough and lost faster than he understood.
Mrs. Margaret sold a portrait to a cousin and kept a clay disc in her sewing box. Lydia learned to read for real, pages, books, and wrote in margins as if her fingers could not help telling the truth where it tried to hide. Pike did not write. Men like him wane when counted by names instead of fears. The wall expanded, not by height, but by meaning. People came who had never crossed Ashdown's gate before except to deliver or obey. They stood with their hats in their hands. They told small stories and big ones. The onion bed gave and gave, its sweetness a dialect everyone could understand. Irisetta became known, not like a heroine, not like a name shouted in a square, but like a person you take your hat off for, even if you forget why. She taught. She mended. She sat with the dying whose families had gone ahead. She kept the map pan on a hook by the door and took it down when a child came with questions. She baked bread that crackled when broken and tasted of time and afternoons. She waited for news and made her own when it didn't come. One evening, years after the day the ground had forced a reckoning, she stood inside the gate and watched Lydia, now a young woman, walk slowly along the long bed, fingers skimming the air above the onion tops as if reading Braille from the green. "I can hear them," Lydia said, smiling not with sorrow, but with a settled gladness. "Then we have done something," Irisetta said. She did not claim enough. She did not say more than what fit in a mouth that had learned to measure. She slept that night and dreamed of a barrel built without a single nail, hoops and staves woven by weather and patience alone. She woke with the idea that men would come one day and say the wall had always been there, that the map had always been known, and that the ground had always told the right story. She burned bread that morning on purpose and let the smoke remind her that forgetting is always easy. Then she taught a child to press a J into clay.
The day came when Silas did not come down to the yard. The house knew it before the doctor came. Death in a man is different than death under a step. It tells different truths. People came in black and did not look at the wall. Lydia sat in the kitchen with Irisetta and June and asked what words should be said at a service for a man who did not undo his harms and also did not stop a wall from being built when a paper told him not to. "Say true," June said. "Say only true." They did. The pastor spoke like a man who has learned that God is best honored by exactness. He said Silas had been loved by some and obeyed by many, and had not refused a legal order when given. He said nothing about mercy, because he had not seen it and would not make it up. The town exhaled. The house shifted. Mrs. Margaret took off her pearls and did not put them back on. She came to the wall each morning and sat with her hands being hands and not something to keep folded. She aged into a woman who helped place stones around the roots of young trees. People whispered. She did not answer them. Irisetta grew older too. Her hands kept their strength and lost their nimbleness in stitches. She could not write on hems as small as she used to, so she taught younger fingers. She liked best to sit with the map pan and listen to a child make its own constellation for the yard. A spoon, a nail, a gate, a ring. On a blue afternoon, the neighbor woman with the ring came back with a little girl whose eyes were devoutly curious. "This is Joanna," she said, and Irisetta smiled at the clever insistence, how families rename to repair. The little girl ran her finger along the gatepost, where the scrap of knots had been swallowed into stone, and she hummed a tune that would have made Lydia laugh. A season later, a man from the city arrived with a camera, a new word that could steal and give in the same action. He asked to take a picture of the wall. Irisetta agreed on the condition that he take one of the kitchen too. "Both," she said, "or you will tell a half story." He took both. Light pouring onto glass, future curiosity, poured into a place where moth and fresh air could not eat it. In time, Ashdown was no longer Ashdown. The land changed owners and then names.
The house lost porches and gained them. The willow fell and a maple rose. But the wall stayed and the gate stayed, and the onion bed kept teaching tongues how to say sweetness that comes after a bitter planting. The ground never stopped speaking. It simply learned a tone people could live with. On the last night of her life, Irisetta sat by the gate with June's blanket over her knees and Lydia's hand in hers, and Cole asleep on the wall with his head thrown back like a boy's. Saul's child, tall now, hands quick, sat on the ground stringing beans. Fireflies took their turns. The air smelled like bread and cut grass, and a storm outpassed the ridge that had decided not to come in. "Tell me the first word," Lydia said, her voice now the timbre of a woman who had raised children and buried none, and had earned her own small peace. Irisetta said, "Before." "And the last?" Lydia asked. "Now," Irisetta answered, and the two words made a bridge over all that had been between. She slept then and did not wake. They buried her inside the wall at the far left, where the onion bed's edge gave way to time. They set no stone because the wall and the gate and the clay letters and the map and Lydia's tune were stones enough. June's blanket lay across the fresh earth for a night and went home smelling of another kind of rest. Years poured themselves into the place as if it were a mold. A group of schoolchildren came every spring and planted scallions and heard a version of the story that did not flinch and did not puncture. A scholar from far away wrote a paper and used the word archive in a sentence about a kitchen. Someone stole one of the clay letters and returned it weeks later with a note that said, "I thought it was just a thing. I learned it is a word. I am sorry." The letter's edge had chipped. They set it back on the sill anyway. Once, vandals painted a slur on the wall. They did it at night with hands more practiced at lying than writing. Morning found it, and the pastor, older now and slower, arrived with lye and rags, as if he had been waiting for the chance. He scrubbed, and then ran his hand along the clean stone and said, "We keep doing this forever." The wall did not resent him. It appreciated being tended. Lydia grew gray-threaded, and then gray-clouded. She danced with a man in the yard to a tune that had started with 2 notes and a child's insistent improvisation, and had become a song people asked for by name without knowing whose hands had made it. She taught others to teach. She revealed letters to people who thought they could never belong to them. She read the knots on old towels with fingertips that had lost a little feeling and made the blurs into meaning anyway. On a warm Sunday, a preacher from the city came and preached too loud. When he had finished, a small girl stepped through the gate and said the names again the way June had taught Irisetta. The preacher wept, not because he had been converted to anything new, but because he had been reminded, in a voice he could not ignore, that the ground under his shiny shoes had a story not his to polish. He ate onion pie and told the town he had eaten sacred food. The photograph the city man had taken faded at the edges, and then came into fashion again because everything does. Young people held it up and angled it toward the light to better see the name scratched into the gatepost. They asked who had built the wall, and were told women, and a man named Cole, and a boy named Soul, and a pastor who made a choice, and a magistrate who wrote what he saw, and neighbors who came because gossip and conscience sometimes arrived together, and a child named Lydia who kept insisting on music, and a woman named Irisetta who could read the ground. A scholar drew a new map, a printed one with neat lines, and brought it to lay beside the old map pan. The lines matched more than either had expected. The song spoon held. The first nail stayed true. In the end, the wall did what good walls do. It kept out a lie and kept in a truth. The gate did what good gates do. It let people pass in and out and taught them to bow at the hinge. The onions did what good onions do.
They layered sweetness over what had cut you and made it food. The house did what houses do. It changed hands and paint, and never quite shook the echo of a kitchen that had once held a jar of clay letters behind vinegar. When children run their fingers along the post and ask, "What does this one say?" someone still answers, "Sea," or "Moon," or both. And when someone asks where the story begins, somebody else says, "Before." And when someone asks where it ends, the wall and the gate and the onions and the map and the ring all say together, if you listen correctly, "Now."